If I told you that a man once served pot roast to two homicide detectives at his own dining room table for days after burying his wife in the backyard, you'd probably assume that's the opening line of a bad joke. It isn't. It's one of the most unsettling true stories we've ever covered on this channel. And by the end of it, you're going to understand exactly how close this man came to getting away with it completely. Viewer discretion is advised. We'll be talking about a homicide within a family, and some of the details are genuinely disturbing, not because of gore, but because of how calm this man managed to stay the entire time. If that's not the vibe you're looking for tonight, no hard feelings, go watch something with puppies in it. If you're still here, though, welcome back to Shadow Stories, the place where we talk about the strange, the dark, and the true stories that somehow feel too outrageous to be real. New episode every week, same calm voice, same too much coffee energy. Before we get into it, like, subscribe, and if you've ever hosted a dinner party specifically to convince people that everything is fine, you already understand this story on a personal level. Also, if you've ever eaten a meal at someone's house and had the distinct, unshakable feeling that something was wrong, but couldn't say what, comment dinner party dread below. I want to know I'm not the only one. Okay, let's get into it. In a mid-sized suburban neighborhood, in a two-story house at the end of a street lined with almost identical houses, lived 41-year-old Gerald Finch and his wife, 38-year-old Denise Finch. On paper, they were the kind of couple neighbors describe, afterward, as quiet, but normal. Gerald sold industrial insurance. Denise ran a small at-home bookkeeping business for a handful of local clients. They'd been married for 11 years and had no children. Neighbors would later say the two of them argued sometimes, the way most married couples do, but nothing that ever seemed alarming. A raised voice here, a slammed car door there. Nothing anyone thought twice about. What none of the neighbors knew, and what Denise's own sister wouldn't find out until much later, was that Denise had quietly told two close friends, in the months leading up to that autumn, that she was planning to leave Gerald. She hadn't told him yet. She was, according to one friend, waiting for the right moment, and had already started looking at apartments online under a private browser tab, the kind of small, careful secret a person keeps when they're not yet ready for a conversation to become a fight. She never got the chance to have that conversation. On a Tuesday evening in late September, Denise Finch disappeared. Gerald reported her missing 3 days later, not immediately, which is a detail that, at the time, nobody thought much of. He told police that Denise had left after an argument, said she needed some time to think, and that he'd assumed she was staying with her sister and simply hadn't wanted to talk to him. When her sister told police she hadn't seen or heard from Denise in over a week, and that this was completely out of character, that's when the case shifted from missing person, probably fine, to something detectives started taking a lot more seriously. Here's where the story gets strange, in the specific way that makes this channel's kind of story. Two detectives, a 15-year veteran named Detective Ruth Okonkwo and her partner, Detective Sam Bellweather, were assigned to the case. Standard procedure in situations like this involves interviewing the spouse more than once, in more than one setting, because in the overwhelming majority of missing spouse cases, the husband or wife knows a great deal more than they're initially willing to say. Gerald was, by every account, extremely cooperative. Too cooperative, Detective Okonkwo would later say in an interview. He answered every question without hesitation. He offered to let them search the house without being asked. And on the fourth day of the investigation, in what has to be one of the boldest moves in the history of this genre, Gerald invited both detectives over for dinner. Not for an interview, for dinner. A real one, at his dining room table, with a pot roast he'd made himself. Because, as he told them at the door, I figure you two have been working so hard on this. The least I can do is feed you." Detective Bellweather would later admit that at the time, the invitation struck him as strange, but not necessarily suspicious. "Some people," he said, "cope with a missing loved one by trying to control something, anything. And cooking a meal for the people looking for your wife is, in a deeply strange way, a form of control." Detective Okonkwo, though, said something felt wrong to her the entire evening, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. They sat at that table for nearly 90 minutes. Gerald talked about Denise constantly, told stories about how they met, showed them photos on his phone, cried twice, genuinely, by all appearances. He asked, more than once, whether the department had any leads, and seemed devastated each time the answer was no. And the entire time, less than 40 feet away, on the other side of a sliding glass door, in a backyard Gerald had specifically mentioned was off-limits because of a sprinkler system he was fixing, Denise's body was buried beneath 18 inches of freshly turned soil and a thin layer of mulch he'd spread the day before to make the disturbed earth look, at a glance, like ordinary yard work. As it would turn out, this detail, the freshly turned soil, was the exact thing that would end up unraveling everything. Roughly 3 weeks after Denise's disappearance, with no other leads developing and Gerald's story remaining frustratingly consistent under repeated questioning, Detective Okonkwo requested a warrant based on something almost embarrassingly small. A neighbor's home security camera, positioned at an angle that happened to catch a sliver of the Finch backyard, had recorded Gerald digging, alone, at nearly 2 a.m., on the same night Denise had supposedly left to think things over. The footage wasn't clear enough to show what he was digging or why, but it was more than enough for a warrant. When detectives returned to the Finch house, not for dinner this time, Gerald once again offered full cooperation, which investigators would later describe as either remarkable confidence or complete detachment from the reality of what was about to happen. Cadaver dogs were brought to the property within the hour. It took the dogs less than 4 minutes to alert on the exact section of yard Gerald had mentioned was off-limits for sprinkler repairs. Denise Finch's body was recovered later that afternoon. The medical examiner would later determine she had died from blunt force trauma, consistent with a single object rather than a prolonged struggle, and that her death had likely occurred on the same night Gerald claimed she'd walked out the door to clear her head. Gerald was arrested that evening, still, according to the arresting officer, calm, almost relieved, as though some part of him had been waiting 3 weeks for this exact moment to arrive. At trial, the prosecution's case centered on the timeline, the argument, the disappearance, the freshly turned soil, and, perhaps most damning of all, the dinner. Prosecutors argued that the dinner wasn't hospitality. It was a performance, a calculated attempt to build sympathy and trust with the exact 2 people investigating him, at the exact moment his wife's body was decomposing in the yard behind them. Gerald's defense argued that the physical evidence, while troubling, didn't definitively prove intent, and attempted to suggest an alternate narrative involving an unknown intruder. The jury did not find this persuasive. After 11 days of testimony, Gerald Finch was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. Detective Okonkwo, in a later interview, said the dinner never left her. Not because of the food, and not even really because of what she now knew had been buried outside, but because of how normal it had all felt in the moment. "He asked me if I wanted seconds," she said. "And I said yes. That's the part one think about. There's a strange thread that runs through cases like this one, and it's worth sitting with for a second before we close out tonight." Gerald Finch wasn't caught because he broke down, or confessed, or made some dramatic mistake under pressure. He was caught because of 18 inches of soil that didn't quite match the yard around it, captured by a neighbor's camera angled in a direction nobody, including Gerald, had thought to consider. The calm, the cooperation, the pot roast, none of it mattered in the end. It was dirt. What this story really comes down to isn't really the horror of it, though there's plenty of that here. It's the reminder that the appearance of normalcy, however convincing, however well performed, is not the same thing as the truth. Gerald Finch could look two detectives in the eye across his own dinner table and cry real tears for a woman he had already killed. That should unsettle you a little. It's supposed to. That's the story of the man who buried his wife in the backyard and then fed the detectives investigating her disappearance a home-cooked meal, 40 feet from where she was buried. If this one got under your skin, that's exactly the point. Hit that subscribe button, because we've got a new one of these every single week, and we promise never to invite ourselves over for dinner while we tell it. And if you've got a story about someone who turned out to be nothing like they seemed, drop it in the comments. We read every single one, usually late at night, alone, with all the lights on, for reasons that should be pretty obvious by now. See you next week. Check your backyard.